This section on law and defense is really going to be at light speed, and I'm going to do both in the same video because they really flow in and around and about through each other. When you do law, you end up doing some of defense. When you do defense, you end up doing some of law. And so I'm going to do them in the same video, and so this is going to be a very long video. First, let's establish that law, in the absence of states, has existed and, to an extent, does exist today. In the past, there was medieval Iceland. In medieval Iceland, one could subscribe to any chieftaincy, who functioned as a judge, jury, and executioner of the law. Now, due to the limits of travel at the time, the chieftaincies tended to be relatively geographically clustered, but in principle, one could choose the arbitration services of any chieftaincy. And so typically where you were, you had a choice between 2 or 3 chieftaincies. Linked is my post where I go into much greater depth on medieval Iceland and how this worked. Eventually, this system failed as a result of the interventions of Norway, and Iceland eventually became part of the Kingdom of Norway, and I go into detail about how that occurred. Then there was medieval Ireland, and Ireland had what was called Brehon law. A Brehon was basically a judge, and one became a Brehon by simply being recognized as such. Towns and settlements needed arbitration because they had disputes, and they would look to a trusted individual. If your rulings carried weight, people would seek your arbitration and pay you for your troubles, and enforcement of the law was carried out by whoever was available in the area. One became a Brehon by discovering the law, and so rather informally, although eventually quite formally, what emerged was Brehon law, similar to English common law prior to its incorporation under King I don't know who it was, but it was kind of like that. Then there's the Western U.S. Now, the Western U.S., before those states became incorporated, had lots of legal arrangements. Most notably are the mining towns, the claims associations, and the town law, or frontier town laws and stuff. People going out into the territories knew that the state had no reach in those areas, and so they had to make arrangements for law upon going out there. The stories about the Wild West are almost entirely Hollywood myths and exaggerations. In reality, the homicide rate in the mild West was lower than in the incorporated states, aside from a few issues involving a cattle conglomerate in Wyoming trying and failing to massacre the competing small-time ranchers in Johnson County. It was known as the Johnson County War. This attempt failed, and circumstantial evidence points to the state looking the other way until the cattle conglomerate's troops were about to be annihilated, at which point the nearest U.S. troops suddenly happened to be on the scene just in time to save the corporate invaders. So I think there might have been some bribery going on, and I make that case in the post linked in the description, but I digress. Even the exceptions in the mild West prove the rule. Were the conflicts between the sheriffs? Were the conflicts between the mining courts? No, they were between some antisocial individuals and their junior high-like feuds. Then today there's Somalia. The Zir is just the common law in Somalia. There's no centralized law-making agency in Somalia anymore, and the various clans mediate disputes by appealing to the Zir, which is analogous to the English common law prior to its codification, and Brehon law. They have judges, and in my estimation it's faster and more predictable than law in the U.S. Obviously, I wouldn't like to live in Somalia, but the legal system probably works better than the U.S. in form, if not in content. And what I mean is that Somalis probably have some very odd laws, some laws I would not approve of, but I would say that this form of law it causes those very nasty, often weird Islamic stuff being enforced rather efficiently. That's what I'm saying. What's more is that the violence in Somalia is not coming from the clans fighting each other, but from invading United Nations and Muslim armies trying to impose a state on that region, just like Britain did in medieval Ireland and just like Norway did in Iceland. And in this environment, the standard of living in Somalia, following a collapsed state and following being invaded, has improved relative to their neighbors, Ethiopia, Kenya, Sudan, as best can be measured. And so that's just something to keep in mind before you just flippantly write off Somalia. Another example of law in the absence of a state is the law merchant, or in Latin lex mercantoria or something, not important. This was law governing the behavior of merchants. In principle, these series of courts and merchants operated independent of any state and had their own internal enforcement mechanisms. Often it would say this person does not honor their contracts, and that would be enough to make it difficult for a merchant to get contracts. And if he's operating on, a 5% profit margin, that could cause him to go out of business. Or the punishments could be violently enforced. If you're more interested in that, you read into that. It's not very hard to read more about that. I need to keep going here. Eventually, the expansions of various state powers destroy this form of common law, this law merchant, but it is an example of law arising in response to a demand for it that states were not providing. There are also many ambiguous cases of what may be described as law coming from non-state agencies such as sea law, bylaws within corporations, and rules and practices among small organizations like churches and even sports teams. Of course, the examples of full-blown stateless societies occurred in frontier lands and in areas on the periphery of more densely populated areas. And this is because anti-statism is not a political movement that has enough support to win elections. Stateless societies only come about in very peculiar circumstances, and the poor environment in which stateless societies have been in should not be used as a mark against the system itself. Furthermore, the chaos of a collapsed state is not evidence that a state always needed to be there. Imagine a shipbuilder saying, you don't need a central column in a ship design, and that a ship can be built with ribbings and be stronger, and that you don't need a central column. Would you test this theory by pointing to ships whose central column had failed, resulting in that ship collapsing? Of course not. Similarly, a collapsed state is not proof that society cannot be built up in a different, non-centralized manner. The reason I brought up those examples is just to show that what I'm going to propose here is not entirely unprecedented. I'm not crazy, is what I'm trying to say. An important distinction exists between lawmakers and law takers, similar to price makers and price takers. For example, McDonald's is a price taker, not a price maker. Sure, they propose a price for each item, but they can't charge whatever they want without losing customers. A lawmaker is an agency that can decide the law and be more or less certain that everyone will follow the law it decides. A law taker is a legal agency that comes up with a basket of laws and services and hopes to get enough customers. If their laws are too out of sync with the demands of society, that legal agency will fail. Now we can speak of an ideal situation with a frontier that slowly gets built up and how law slowly builds up with it, as happened before in some of the larger settlements in the stateless West. But today we don't have that luxury of the slow build-up with law building up along with cities in an emergent stateless environment. What we have now is a huge web of contracts and people having their lives planned around the assumption that state law would be there. So there needs to be a transition plan that takes these into account and provides law immediately and sustains current contracts. So this is not a frontier land where we can say, all right, let's try a new system in an environment where there's no baggage. Right now we have a whole lot of baggage, and there needs to be a system in place to deal with that immediately. And the transition plan that I have is thus. First, the U.S. is divided up into legal districts, and everyone is assigned to a district and is registered as a customer of that legal agency. And these districts initially are relatively geographically contiguous. The court may also have an enforcement arm, or police or other enforcement agency may enforce the restitution for crimes. I do not know the optimal arrangement for courts and enforcement, just as I don't know if it's optimal for the farm and the supermarket to be owned by the same company or not. And so initially, everyone has the same law, and it's exactly like it was under a state. And this is because we need law immediately. However, anyone can choose to purchase the legal services of any other legal agency in the entire stateless society. In Minnesota, you can purchase, you can subscribe to a legal agency in California. Thus, people would buy into legal agencies whose laws and procedures best reflected their values and interests. And so, while an initial legal system is imposed, it has the room to evolve. Now, what prevents people from buying into a legal agency with bizarre laws and reward their clients with millions in every case or something like that, or a legal agency that says, our clients can steal from the clients of others? Well, those legal agencies would not be able to harmonize with the others, and they would not be able to get along. See, all of these legal agencies, in order to be effective, they have to harmonize laws, and they have to make protocols with each other, and they have to get along. It needs to be easy for individuals under one jurisdiction to interact with individuals from another. For that strange legal agency, they won't be accepted as legitimate by the other agencies, and so few would buy their services. It wouldn't even really be regarded as a legal agency at all, assuming it is that out of sync with the others. I don't know the correct way to harmonize laws. Now, I know it has been done in a statist context between state jurisdictions, but I don't know the correct way or the best way to do it, or what the best laws for easements are, or what the best laws for water rights are. The experts are the ones in the situation, and the way to get good law is case by case, or case law. And we have this today with the state monopoly legal system. We have case law. Unfortunately, in addition to this, we also have legislation, or Congress law. And nobody has any alternative to the state monopoly legal system. That's the problem of it. If prior examples of stateless law are any guide, there is a natural drive to standardize law across the entire society. Similar to how you have standardized credit card sizes. You don't have triangular credit cards. You have standardized shoe sizes, railway gauges, soda can sizes, etc. And none of this standardization comes about through some central plan. It just comes about that that's the easiest way to do things. You have standardized sizes for electronics so they can fit in furniture. And you will probably find some strange laws in small towns, but you have that today. If some small borough kidnaps you for violating some stupid law, then that's a matter of police or even of national defense, depending on how out of sync these local laws are, whether they violate the laws of the other legal agencies, and if they want to intervene and help you out, basically viewing this as not a matter of a separate legal jurisdiction, but as a matter of just terrorism. Right? And of course that's a case-by-case issue. That's not something I, from on high, can decide. But generally we can expect an elimination of labyrinthine and contradictory law codes in favor of short, but not too short ones, assuming that that's what people want, and that is what I'm assuming. Imagine what you would try to do if you were the head of a legal agency, perhaps developing a program that finds the relevant laws that someone should know about depending on what they do for a living. Like they just say what they do and various other relevant information, and then the program tells them that they need to be aware of these statutes. Of course, you can't please everyone, and if all the legal agencies piss off too many people, it's possible that a new legal agency can form which doesn't abide by all of the laws of the incumbent legal agencies, and so that would be considered a rogue legal agency. And this rogue legal agency would then be blackballed by the incumbent legal agencies. However, if enough people join the rogue legal agency, say 20%, then they can no longer be realistically squeezed off by the incumbent legal agencies, and they effectively must be dealt with. And so if all the legal agencies form this pact of thieves to prevent the entry of any new legal agencies, and they start doing a bunch of BS, that can only work if they can squeeze off any new forming legal agency. If the new legal agency gets up to about 20%, then you start getting cascading flee from the pact. That is, more incumbent legal agencies find it beneficial to do business with this quote rogue close quote legal agency, and so they can form their own networks and economies of scale that way. Now let's take the scenario of all legal agencies in the former U.S. getting together and demanding that everyone pay 30% of their income to them, or something absurd, something bizarre. All the legal agencies in the U.S. somehow they managed to coordinate this, managed to get together and demand everyone pay 30% of their income to them, and that these legal agencies wouldn't recognize any new legal agency that tried to form. What you have is a national outcry and a few highly respected authority figures getting on TV to announce that they are forming a new legal agency to combat the legal tyrannies of the cartel or something like that. However, this is not something that has ever happened. The Brions, the chieftaincies, nor the merchant law judges ever colluded in this fashion to get something like some tax or something like that. It's risky and it ruins their reputations, which is the only reason their judgment is sought out anyway. In fact, legal agencies are unique in that the value of their services depend entirely on their reputations, and so we can expect them to be less likely to do something like this than car companies, for example, which, of course, while dependent on their reputations, all companies are, less so than legal agencies, not entirely. Car companies are dependent on their reputations, of their high-quality production process. So I guess you could say they are dependent entirely on their reputations, but in a different way than the legal agencies. So, but even the idea of cars companies colluding, well, that's another section. The notion of dueling legal agencies, there's something that a lot of people fear. This is just silly and ahistorical. It's as silly as the idea that Ford and GM will field armies and duke it out, if not for the U.S. military waiting in the wings. War is expensive, and agencies that go to war to eliminate competition will lose customers and can face everyone around them breaking their contracts without any reputation loss for them. That is, you can disown this legal agency because they have engaged in war, they've gone rogue, and they are now outlaws. And so you can cancel your contracts with them and cancel any debts you may have with them without any repercussions. Even the act of building up an army would cost money for a legal agency, and so that makes your legal services more expensive than your competition. Now, raising an army would require the agency to charge uncompetitive rates, and now let's assume they could do this. Let's assume that they could somehow find a way to do this. And so even if they could raise an army, who would they attack? Who would they secure the surrender of? There are no capitals in a stateless society. I guess they could try to impose taxes on neighborhoods, but people can just move away from that. And I'll get into the next section on defense as to why this is very much unlikely to work. Very unlikely to work. Almost certainly not going to work. The real danger, as I see it, is that people will start looking upon these legal agencies with the same reverence that they did with the first states. But I do not believe this will happen, given how paranoid people are about regular companies today, like oil companies are really paranoid about them, and I think they would be much more paranoid about legal agencies, constant investigations. And the first states came about when man was of a sophistication that the stories about Horus and Osiris were believable, and most people were illiterate. And linked in the description will be my argument as to why states would not reform in a stateless society today. Some say that technology is so much different today, and so those legal orders in medieval Ireland and Iceland, they're not relevant for our society today. Society is much more complex, and so these old examples, they're not relevant. And I disagree. Communication technology gives each individual much more choice in legal arrangements and makes geographic limitations to choice less relevant than it was in Ireland or Iceland. And so we should expect law to standardize even faster today than in medieval Ireland or medieval Iceland because of things like the internet, or things just like the telephone even. And this communication technology allows individuals to know of other options they may have as far off as across the entire former U.S., whereas someone in Ireland may not know about a alternative judge to deal with outside of a 10-mile radius. So this objection about warring legal agencies is just something I find so strange. We all know that judges predated kings, and the ancient judges didn't raise armies to attack others. The wars in Ireland and Iceland, if you could even call them that, they're more like feuds between families and clans, kind of like in the stateless U.S. They were based on clan and family relationships, not on the legal system. They weren't chieftaincies, they weren't legal agencies, they weren't judges going to war with each other, judges raising armies and leading them against each other. For people who say they don't like to just assert things, people who bring up this objection sure have no problem asserting that states would form from warring legal agencies, despite there being no evidence of this ever happening. Today, there is one court in the United States, the Supreme Court, and all of the other courts are just franchises of the Supreme Court. They are not independent entities. What I am proposing is a real alternative system, not those insane, quote, private arbitration, and close quote, those star chambers that are really just a tool for corporations to rule however they want with the backing of the state. I mean real polycentric law where you can appeal horizontally. If you don't like this, if you don't want the possibility of horizontal appeals, if you want the certainty of a single court system, don't ever want a case being in limbo, then fine. Fine. In a stateless society, you can submit yourself to a single court. I won't stop you. I'd rather be able to appeal horizontally. I'll take the risk. I'll take the risk of having a case being in limbo. I urge you to see the emergent order instead of being afraid of freedom and granting ultimate legal power to an ultimately unaccountable agency, and to recognize that there are so many, many ways that law can work. Law is far more flexible and can be done in so many more ways than people realize, and while law itself can be a complex subject, the basic systems, the form of law, are not difficult to establish. The notion that the current legal systems are these finely tuned, high-strung machines that would break if so much as one element was changed is an archonic fantasy. The current systems are not expertly crafted. They're a chaotic mess of Congress and case law that most certainly contradict in many areas, but the law is so vast that nobody really knows. Right? You're probably breaking a law right now. Law without a state had always involved the judges discovering the law and applying the best solutions which emerged. The idea of law decided beforehand, decided in preemption of disputes, a top-down legal construction is, quite frankly, utopian. It's just as utopian as any other form of central planning. The next segment is on stateless defense. How would a stateless society protect itself from other states? Certainly not having a capital or fantasy structure makes invading a stateless society much harder. When Germany invaded France, for example, they didn't have to establish bureaus and tax collection agencies. All that infrastructure was already there, and it was just co-opted by the German state. When invading a stateless society, all of that stuff has to be created. And this is difficult, but it's not impossible. It has been done. A clear example being the British conquest of Ireland. The British easily conquered India, which was their biggest, and in which their biggest opponents were other European states and the Mughal army and some other armed group. By co-opting the fantasy structure and placing themselves at the top, the British were able to easily conquer India. The Irish, on the other hand, despite being much smaller and much closer, took hundreds of years to conquer. The current quagmire in Iraq and Afghanistan are also examples of the difficulty of a state army trying to defeat an opponent that has no centrality. In Ireland, the British would invade, they'd defeat an army, and then secure the surrender of various heads of law of various towns and various natural elites of tribes and stuff, although, sedentary farming tribes. And they'd secure the surrender of people who the British erroneously dubbed kings or lords, saying that they secured the lords' pledges. Of course, there weren't no lords. And then the British would go home, and then they would find out that the Irish had stopped paying the British any mind because the British had just left. The British would have to place a guard full-time at each block to secure Ireland in that condition. Although most guerrillas are statists, they're still a foe without a statist fantasy structure to co-opt and to secure a surrender from. And so they illustrate a certain advantage that stateless defense has. But guerrilla armies have been defeated in the past. And I'm not advocating guerrilla defense as a prime mode of defense for a stateless society. I'm just illustrating this dynamic, and this dynamic will become important later. Guerrilla warfare is for simple economies that can be rebuilt in a single planting season with subsistence farmers who are used to hardship, not intricately calibrated industrial economies with pampered Americans who have never seen death. However, I do believe that the U.S. can manage a guerrilla war against a defense agency, not against another state. But that's getting a little bit ahead of myself. So really, how does a stateless society defend itself? Well, some anti-statists will just say nukes and end the conversation right there. Okay, so your plan for defense is just donations to raise $1 billion for nukes. Whatever. That's not difficult. Americans give $300 billion to charity annually. Charity could easily fund defense up to like $10 billion. And so, although in my opinion it can go up to $100 billion, that's what I believe, charity could fund defense that high. But whatever. It could easily fund nukes. So, now you have a bunch of nukes, and they're all being maintained, and they're all ready to fire at anyone who dares to invade the stateless former U.S. Yeah, you'd have to be mad to invade a country with nukes. And so you have the situation, and then China invades. Now what? Fire the nukes? A stateless society needs a standing army that can repel invasions from other states in a conventional manner. This army must act collectively. An attack on Maine must be defended with resources from San Diego. Otherwise, the state can slowly digest the entire former U.S. piece by piece. There's an obvious free rider problem here, though. Why should any individual pay for defense when the other guy who's paying for defense has to pay for you because he's defending for a relatively contiguous area? Defense is inherently collective. Now, my solution to the problem is actually quite simple. The solution is, although I'm going to have some extensive argumentation for it, the solution is that it is to be the law of the land that in order to be within the purview of the law, that is to have access to law, have access to courts and jurisdiction, and have your contracts be enforced, you must pay the defense due, unless you are destitute. So in a stateless society, we have a clear definition of the destitute. That is someone who is not legally required to pay for defense, and who usually doesn't have to pay for other public goods because he is so poor, and so he just gets the free ride. That's it. Whereas, for example, with the fire protection, if you are able to pay for fire protection and your house catches on fire, yet you don't pay for fire protection, the fire agency will come to your house and put out the fire, but then they're going to charge you a very high fee. However, if you are destitute, they'll come out and put out the fire, even though you didn't pay for fire protection, right? Just simply because you're destitute, and there's no point in trying to get money from you, or to try to get blood from a rock. It'd be bad PR. All that stuff. It's just more efficient to allow the destitute to free ride. Although you have to, that begs the question, what is destitute? And that's something to be decided by the legal agencies. Moving on. If someone has the means to pay for the defense due, and they don't pay it, then they no longer qualify for legal protection, and no action against them is a crime, right? Because they are outlaws. They are set outside the law. Any action taken against them, they have no legal recourse because they are outside of the law. Now, clearly, I have some explaining to do here. Please note that this is not a solution I've come to precipitously. In a stateless society, there is law. The only laws which come about are those which have what I have labeled operationally universal support. And that is things that are supported by, quote, just about everyone, close quote. Things like no stealing, no rape, no unjustified killing, etc. These are all laws that just about everyone agrees upon. Moreover, laws without a state can also compel action, not just sanction against certain things. For example, in medieval Ireland, they had laws compelling someone who didn't pay back a debt to be the slave to the creditor until the debt was paid off. He was compelled to do what the creditor demanded within certain limits and in a manner that was designed to help the person pay off the debt. And this law had operational universal support. And so there was slavery in Ireland that compelled action if you were a debtor, and it had operational universal support. But what does operational universal support really mean? Well, actually, I don't know what it means precisely. In my mind's eye, it's around 90% support for something. But even that is a little bit misleading. For example, there could be 90% support for everyone else having your money if you went around asking them, but they won't do it because it's not worth the hassle of going to your place and taking guns and shipping all that stuff off. It's not worth the hassle. They don't want to deal with it. So intensity of belief matters as well for operationally universal support. It's whatever breadth and depth of support some measure has, be it a law against theft or rape, or a compulsion to pay for a particular service, or a compulsion to work in the service of a creditor. Theoretically, you could have a giant welfare scheme identical to what exists today in a stateless society if it has enough support over a given geographic area. However, I do not believe this is the case, as welfare schemes in the U.S. do lack this operational universal support. However, defense does have operational universal support in the U.S. today, and I will link to a poll in the description that shows this. Currently, there are 150 million wage earners in the U.S., of which, let's be very conservative and assume only 100 million of which can pay for their own public services. So we have 100 million people who can pay for the defense due. Now, the legal agencies would require that if you earn above a certain amount, that you must pay for defense. And this is on a sliding scale from $0 to $2,000, averaging at about $1,000 per person. Of course, in a stateless society, you wouldn't be using dollars, but it would be that equivalent in silver ounces or gold or whatever. And that would total $100 billion for defense in a stateless society. And it would all be for defense, not offense, unless that's what people wanted to pay for. And I assert it would be done much more efficiently. But what constitutes defense? Well, the legal agencies have to determine what constitutes a defense agency and what doesn't. You can't just give money to a casino and then just say, whoa, this is for defense. Casinos, this is a defense base or something. No, you can't do that. The legal agency has to engage in some line drawing in order to determine what constitutes defense and what doesn't. And perhaps not counting certain things that disguise themselves as defense agencies but are just ways of embezzling money, and that's something that the legal agencies are just going to have to sort out. That's a certain ambiguity that the legal agencies will just have to deal with. Well, why won't people just subscribe to legal agencies that don't require you to pay for defense at all? Well, the answer is that those legal agencies will be outlawed by everyone else. That is, the rogue legal agency that they subscribe to won't be able to interact with other legal agencies as they have broken the law by not requiring people to pay their share for defense. Right? Just like they would with a legal agency that claimed it was okay to steal from members of other legal agencies, which is kind of what's going on here. How would this defense due be put in place initially? Well, the same way the entire legal system is, and that is by some central transition plan. Ideally, anti-statists would control the fantasy structure of the state and be able to impose a central plan for a stateless society from the top down, but this plan would then be able to evolve in a market, perhaps in a direction that I can't even fathom. The law requiring the defense due for legal services would just be another one of these laws imposed just before the leap to statelessness. However, this plan for law and defense can also be put in place in the environment of a collapsed state. That would involve the area of a stateless society to be saturated with this plan. The legal agencies, the police, the public services, everyone needs to know the plan. They need to know what is to be done, what would be done in a stateless society, and have this plan in hand. Then, when the state collapses and there is an order vacuum, and people don't know what's going on, they immediately have a common plan. They immediately have like either a book in their hand, a pamphlet in their hand, or something. They have a common plan and a common law that everyone now knows to turn to, as they know what to do in this disaster situation of a collapsed state. What would prevent the defense agency from pointing their guns inward into the stateless society and just forming a new state? Remember what we were talking about with the guerrilla wars? Let's say the defense agencies all got together and tried to impose a state on the former U.S., or it was one monopoly defense agency, or whatever. They tried to point their guns inward and form a state in the former U.S. Where would they attack? How would they fund the invasion? There is no capital, no state to secure the surrender of and just place oneself at the top of, like the British did in India. They would have to create the infrastructure of taxation from the ground up. Of course, the UK did this successfully in Ireland, and the Russian Empire over time did this successfully in Central Asia, and the US waged a savage, successful anti-partisan war in the Philippines. But you see, those were all states with stable external resource bases, external tax bases. The Iraq War is maintained through ideological support for the state at home. More money is spent on that war in Iraq than the GDP of Iraq. A defense agency trying to form a state in a stateless society has no external tax base. All of its funds came from the area that it's now trying to conquer. It would be like the U.S. Army trying to occupy Iraq with the funds it could extract from Iraq. This is not theoretically or analytically impossible, it's just utterly ahistorical. In addition to this problem, the surrounding states may smell blood in the water and invade, as the defense agencies were trying to do this. The U.S. Army today is much more likely to succeed in a military coup than a stateless defense force. All the U.S. military has to do is march on the Capitol, kill whatever pro-democracy, loyalist hardliners are there defending the Congress and the Constitution and everything. And being the U.S. military, they already have a veil of legitimacy and an approval rating far higher than that of Congress or the President. Now, of course, how high would it remain after a coup? I don't know. But the point is that the military today is in a much better position to take over than friggin' Cobra Command in a stateless society or whatever. Most military research and development is already done by, quote, private, close quote, agencies today, and private agencies like Blackwater have proven themselves capable of raising combat troops, and various private armies in Africa have successfully overthrown states. Now, these, of course, have been done at a smaller scale. What I'm advocating is a much larger scale with much scaled-up weaponry, but the principle is the same. The state doesn't have any special abilities, especially since most, if not virtually all, of the people in the stateless former U.S. armies would be ex-military personnel and use ex-U.S. military equipment. Now, I've gotten the criticism that what I'm proposing is hiring mercenaries, and which are inherently unreliable. And to that I have to say, just whatever. Okay, today the state pays men with guns to defend an area, and in my system, the legal agencies would require you to pay men with guns to defend an area. Calling one a mercenary system and the other something else is not meaningful. What to do with the U.S. military equipment is not something I have an answer for, or at least an adequate answer for. Right now, my stopgap answer is to divide it up among the multiple agencies, though I doubt they would use all of it. The defense agencies would be companies instantiated by the state just before the leap to statelessness. Right? Just like the legal agencies and the defense do are all instantiated before the leap to statelessness. So you would have, say, 5 companies say, poof, these are the companies now. The equipment is divided up this way, is centrally planning these companies. Of course, once the state is gone, these defense agencies can disband, they can absorb one another, they can grow, and new agencies can enter the market so long as they prove that they're actually using resources for national defense that the legal agencies would approve them. A problem with this model of defense is that, like a state, it is somewhat disconnected from the market because as an individual you are required to spend your money on defense somehow, and you choose how. However, the effects of your choice are not felt either immediately or directly, like when you buy a soda pop. You buy a soda, if you don't like it, I don't like this, I'm not going to buy this ever again. But you're not quite sure, so you don't know if you made the right choice in the matter of defense until, say, China invades. Then your choice gets tested and succeeds or fails. But that's a criticism that's true of statist defense as well. And so I don't see this solution as being necessarily any more or any less efficient than statist defense. Perhaps individuals sending off their defense due checks would be less wise on matters of defense than the current central planners of defense are, but that is partially ameliorated by the fact that the defense due agencies are the ones actually organizing the defense. It's not like these people with their checks are saying, how should we do this? Let's all band together and have a town hall meeting about how to have a defense. No, they're taking their checks, mailing them to defense agencies, which are all former U.S. military personnel, and would then carry on all those things, and they would then deal with defense. Also, the current U.S. military has operations around the world, which makes statist defense less efficient per dollar and creates more enemies around the world. There are also politics within the U.S. military. For example, the fighter pilots constantly lobby to focus spending on new manned aircraft instead of the more maneuverable unmanned aircraft. Currently, there are multiple branches of the U.S. military which all have to coordinate, and so the argument about multiple defense agencies having to coordinate a defense, that is not a problem that is unique to this model of defense. We already have multiple defense agencies under the purview of the state. It is up to the generals to decide what is best for defense in the stateless nation. If the generals decide to get involved in some war, then the people can voice their disapproval by sending their checks to other defense agencies, some new defense agencies, some anti-war defense agencies. One may say that what I propose here, this defense due and legal agencies, is a state, and if they say that what I'm proposing is a state, that's a conceptual error. Remember, the problem with the state is its law-making ability as opposed to law-taking ability. And these legal agencies can only set laws in the way McDonald's sets its price product. I am not against law. I'm not against punishment for crime or trespassing, and I'm not against duty to pay for collective defense. If that's what you're against, then go join the anarchists. The problem is the arbitrary power of a centralized law-making agency. What I'm doing here is explaining how defense can be managed without a centralized law-making agency. I'm not trying to come up with some way in which defense can be managed voluntarily. And even technically speaking, these legal agencies are not forcing you to pay for defense in the way the state currently is. For example, if you don't pay for defense, then you are simply outside the purview of the law. These legal agencies are not saying that if you don't pay for defense, you get thrown in prison or you get shot or something like that. So they're not prescribing force against people who don't pay their taxes or something. They're just saying, oh, you don't want to pay for defense? That's fine. We're not going to force you. However, don't come crying to us when some guy on the street beats you up. That's what it is. And so even technically, it's not a state. This model of defense that I'm putting forward is my model. Now, I'm not asking someone to become an anti-statist based on the strength of this model for law and defense. Right now, anti-statism, sometimes referred to erroneously as anarcho-capitalism, is a fringe element within the Libertarian Party. And the Libertarian Party itself is something of a fringe movement. And so, as anti-statism becomes larger, if it becomes larger, its justifications will become more elaborate, more studies will be done, more research by more people in think tanks, and to a lesser extent, those university things. My goal with this series is not to propose a model that will definitely work, but just one that I think will work. And just to come up with various solutions to these problems to put these things in view, so to speak, and say, look, these things have been done in the past. Look, here is a way that it looks like it could be done. That's what I'm trying to do here, and trying to create something of a meta-model for a stateless society. If this ever became a movement, some grand political movement, of course, it would become much more academic, much more professional, much more depth. And so what I'm asking now is not to worship my specific model or anything like that.